Nowadays, I think of our government not as of the people, by the people, for the people, but rather as an enemy government in occupation. Less and less makes any sense to me. People are struggling all around this country and all around the world. In many cases, it's nothing less than a life and death struggle. Talk about to be or not to be. For too many, that truly is the question. And those in positions of power, hypothetically in a position to help, are, on the contrary, making matters worse. The war we should all be paying closer attention to is not just the one in Ukraine, but that being waged all around us right now by greedy governments and their best friends, the transnational corporations, against their own people to keep those people down. The powers that be have let it be known there may be food shortages ahead. This is at the same time as those same powers that be are going out of their way to make it harder for farmers to produce food. Why are governments in the West harassing their farmers into giving up their land and culling their herds instead of encouraging them to produce more food and not less? This behaviour makes no sense to me. Billionaires like Bill Gates and John Kerry fly around the world in private jets. We all know that pound for pound, private jets generate the most emissions. If it really was about cutting emissions, those billionaires would take the simple step of stopping using private jets. But no, their response, the solution they prefer, is to make even more of those polluting flights so that they can preach against the use by us, the common folk, of the much more efficient passenger planes. This makes no sense to me. By far the best way to help poor people is to enable them to lift themselves out of poverty so they can take care of themselves and raise healthy, educated, well-adjusted children. Rather than by war in Ukraine, I say the ever-worsening hardship and relentless suffering of millions is caused by ideologically driven wickedness. Instead, in the past 3 years, we've seen the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in all of history. More recently, even those who had only recently elevated themselves out of generations of poverty and into the emergent middle classes are being actively impoverished once more by the dedicated and deliberate actions of governments. Homes are being made harder to hold on to and harder to heat. Food and energy are deliberately being made ruinously expensive. In what rational universe does any of that make sense? Unless, of course, the presence of independent, healthy, educated, confident people is anathema to governments. Nowadays, I think of our government not as of the people, by the people, for the people, but rather as an enemy government in occupation. I say all that we are seeing, after 3 years like no others, 3 years of harms deliberately inflicted, are blatant attempts by governments and their little wizards to cover up and otherwise distract from the consequences of their own actions. Rather than by war in Ukraine, I say the ever-worsening hardship and relentless suffering of millions is caused by ideologically driven wickedness. The looming threat of God knows what next, whatever they try to frighten us with next, nuclear war, war with China, international terrorism. Noticeably, we haven't had any international terrorism for quite a while. Will surely keep many on edge and ready to comply with whatever life and freedom diminishing nonsense is proposed. What does make sense to me is history. In June 1816, the French ship Medusa set sail for Senegal with 400 passengers and crew. The captain was an upper-class incompetent, granted his position on account of who he was rather than his ability. On the 2nd of July, the Medusa ran aground off the West African coast. There was room in the lifeboats for just 250. The rest, at least 146 men and 1 woman, were put aboard a hastily assembled raft. The initial plan and promise was for the boats to tow the raft to safety, but after just a few miles, the ropes were cut. The poorest were literally cut adrift in the open sea with almost nothing. Tragically, but understandably, in those most dreadful of circumstances, the situation descended in the end into savage fighting and cannibalism. By the time they were rescued, purely by chance, only 13 men were left alive. The scandal was memorialised in the painting The Raft of the Medusa by the French artist Theodore Géricault, a more blatant and shaming demonstration of the abandonment of the poor by the powerful committed only to their own survival, even if it must mean the dehumanising debasement and sacrifice of those less fortunate, is hard to imagine. It's all there to be seen on one vast 23 feet by 16 feet canvas. History has a great deal to teach us if we will only pay attention to it. It boils down to this: it's all happened before, and it will keep happening until we say no. Rather than by war in Ukraine, I say the ever-worsening hardship and relentless suffering of millions is caused by ideologically driven wickedness.